In this second episode, we're going to look over types of selection and how it leads to reproductive isolation and speciation, to hammer home some concepts from episodes previous and to introduce some important new concepts. Now, before we get into it, I want to introduce one piece of terminology: phenotype. And this is actually pretty clear. It just means the physical characteristics of the organism. That's color, size, what organs it has, all that stuff that are the pieces that actually make up the animal or plant or bacteria. So let's get into selection. As we know from last time, certain traits are beneficial to organisms and get selected for over time because they do better in the environment and therefore result in more offspring with the same traits. But there are actually 4 kinds of selection, and let's go over each one. The first one we want to go over is stabilizing selection. And this is when the most common phenotype, the average phenotype, is selected for. And extremes away from this phenotype are not advantageous. And the best way to learn this is, again, with an example. So let's say we have a population of birds that have variable beak sizes, and their prey is beetles that live in small holes in the barks of trees. Now, birds that have beaks that are too small can fit their beaks into the holes, but their beaks don't have the tools necessary to properly break the shell of the beetles that live in there. And birds with beaks too large can easily break the shells of beetles, but can't properly fit their beaks into the holes that those beetles live in. So, birds with medium-sized beaks can grab beetles from their dens and can properly break through their shells. So as you can see, beak sizes would remain the same. Any birds born with beaks too large or beaks too small would not be as effective and therefore have less kids and not become a bigger portion of the population. Now, the second type of selection is directional selection. This is where one extreme works well and one extreme does badly. And this would result in the trait moving towards one extreme and away from the other. So for example, if we had a field populated with mice, and this is a field of tall grass, bigger mice would tend to get spotted by birds much more often, and smaller mice would tend to be much more capable of hiding under the tall grass, and therefore would be better disguised than the bigger mouse. So the bigger mouse is more likely to die, and therefore the larger the mouse, the more likely it is to die. The smaller the mouse, the less likely it is to die. So over time, the mouse population would drift smaller and smaller and smaller, basically in one direction, away from larger mice and towards smaller mice. Now, the third type of selection is disruptive selection, and this one's very important. So essentially, this is where the average phenotype, the middle phenotype, is less successful than either extreme. So for example, let's say we have some lizards. They want to blend in to hide from predatory turkeys. Now they come in a range of colors, from bright green to yellow-green to bright yellow, all across the spectrum here. The ones that are in one extreme, that being bright green, can easily blend into the hydrated grass by the lake because it's also bright green. The ones on the other extreme, bright yellow, can easily blend into the inland savanna grass because it's yellow in color. Now, neither of them would blend in very well on the other's territory and would therefore get eaten by turkeys. Now, on the other hand, lizards on neither extreme do not blend in to either environment well, and therefore are not very successful and get killed much more often by turkeys. This type of selection is notable because it can lead to speciation very quickly, because as you can see, it pushes both varieties of organisms away from each other quickly. And all of these are ways that the population can evolve over time. Now, one last thing we should go over is reproductive isolation, and this is related to disruptive selection. So, because we know children of organisms tend to have a trait somewhere in between their parents' traits. Quick editor's note here, and I just want to say that I said organisms have traits that are between their parents' traits, and that's not exactly true. The exact specifics of how organisms pass on their traits is going to be explained in the next episode. And practically, it often results in organisms simply having the average traits of their parents, but that's not exactly or specifically how it works. But we will learn how it works in the next episode, so just hold off until then, but don't go off with false knowledge. So, because we know children of organisms tend to have a trait somewhere in between their parents' traits, then we can see that when two groups are dividing, such as the lizards, in which some of them are going to be green and some of them are going to be yellow, Any crossbreeding between the two would result in a middle phenotype child that's going to be less successful. So if a bright green lizard, which is successful, and a bright yellow lizard, which is successful breed, they're going to have a yellow-green child that's not going to be good in any environment. So therefore, a mutation which makes one of those varieties less attracted to the other sexually would be beneficial, as it would lead to less intermixing and therefore resulting in a lower chance of them producing this sort of unfit offspring that's the middling phenotype. In the same vein, mutations which make their reproductive organs less compatible with the other extreme would be similarly beneficial. So as you can see, all of these factors would compound into very swift speciation because it is beneficial for both groups of organisms, both the green and the yellow, to not intermix with each other, to make sure they don't produce these sort of unsuccessful offspring. So that's it for this quick episode here. We're going to be on to the episode number 3 very soon, and we're going to be moving on to some even more interesting concepts. So subscribe to catch that one soon, and I hope it to be up at the end of the week.